was pleasantly warm and dimly lighted by the embers of a fire in the grate. "Let us undress here," said Diana. "It's so nice and warm." "Hasn't it been a delightful time?" sighed Anne, rapturously. "It must be splendid to get up and recite there. Do you suppose we'll ever be asked to do it, Diana?" "Yes, of course, some day. There is always wanting a big scholar to recite. Gilbert Blythe does it often, and he is only 2 years older than us." "Oh, Anne, how could you pretend not to listen to him? When he came to the line, 'There's another, not a sister,' he looked right down at you." "Diana," said Anne, with dignity, "you are my bosom friend, but I cannot allow you to speak to me of that person. Are you ready for bed? Let's run a race and see who will get to the bed first." The suggestion appealed to Diana. The two little white clad figures flew down the long room through the spare room door, and bounded on to the bed at the same moment; and then something moved beneath them. There was a gasp and a cry, and some one said in muffled accents, "Merciful goodness!" Anne and Diana were never able to tell just how they got off that bed and out of the room. They only knew that after one frantic rush they found themselves tiptoeing shiveringly upstairs. "Who was it? What was it?" whispered Anne, her teeth chattering with cold and fright. "It was Aunt Josephine," said Diana, gasping with laughter. "Oh, Anne, it was Aunt Josephine! However she came to be there. Oh, I know she'll be furious. It's dreadful, it's really dreadful. Did you ever know anything so funny, Anne?" "Who's your Aunt Josephine?" "She's father's aunt, and she lives in Charleston. She's awfully old, 70 anyhow, and I don't believe she was ever a little girl. We were expecting her out for a visit, but not so soon. She's awfully prim and proper, and she'll scold dreadfully about this, I know. But we'll have to sleep with Minnie May, and you can't think how she kicks." Miss Josephine Barry did not appear at the early breakfast next morning. Mrs. Barry smiled kindly at the two little girls. "Did you have a good time last night? I tried to stay awake until you came home, for I wanted to tell you Aunt Josephine had come, and that you'd have to go upstairs after all; but I was so tired I fell asleep. I hope you didn't disturb your aunt, Diana." Diana preserved a discreet silence, but she and Anne exchanged furtive smiles of guilty amusement across the table. Anne hurried home after breakfast, and so remained in blissful ignorance of the disturbance which presently resulted in the Barry household until the late afternoon, when she went down to see Mrs. Lynde on an errand for Marilla. "So you and Diana nearly frightened old Miss Barry to death last night," said Mrs. Lynde severely, but with a twinkle in her eye. "Mrs. Barry was here a few minutes ago on her way to Carmody. She's feeling real worried over it. Old Mrs. Barry was in a terrible temper when she got up this morning, and Josephine Barry's temper is no joke, I can tell you that. She wouldn't speak to Diana at all." "It wasn't Diana's fault," said Anne contritely. "It was mine. I suggested racing to see who would get into bed first." "I knew it," said Mrs. Lynde, with the exultation of a correct guesser. "I knew that idea came out of your head. Well, it's made a nice lot of trouble, that's what. Old Mrs. Barry came out to stay for a month, but she declares she won't stay another day, and is going back to town tomorrow, Sunday and all as it is. She'd have gone today if she could have taken her. She had promised to pay for a quarter's music lesson for our Diana, but now she's determined to do nothing at all for such a tomboy. Oh, I guess they had a lively time of it there this morning. The Barrys must feel cut up. Old Miss Barry is rich, and they'd like to keep on the good side of her. Of course Mrs. Barry didn't say that to me, but I'm a pretty good judge of human nature, that's what." "Oh, I'm such an unlucky girl," mourned Anne. "I'm always getting into scrapes myself, and getting my best friends, people I'd shed my heart's blood for, into them too. Can you tell me why it is so, Mrs. Lynde?" "It's because you're too heedless and impulsive, child, that's what. You never stop to think. Whatever comes into head, you say or do it without a moment's reflection." "Oh, but that's the best part of it," protested Anne. "Something just flashes into your mind so exciting, and you must out with it. If you ever stop to think it over, you spoil it all. Haven't you ever felt that yourself, Mrs. Lynde?" No, Mrs. Lynde had not. She shook her head sadly. "You must learn to think a little, and that's what. The proverb you need to go by is 'Look before you leap,' especially into spare room beds." Mrs. Lynde laughed comfortably over her mild joke, but Anne remained pensive. She saw nothing to laugh at in the situation, which to her eyes appeared very serious. When she left Mrs. Lynde, she took her way across the crusted fields to Orchard Slope. Diana met her in the kitchen door. "Your Aunt Josephine was very cross about it, wasn't she?" whispered Anne. "Yes," answered Diana, stifling a giggle with an apprehensive glance over her shoulder at the closed sitting room door. "She was fairly dancing with rage, Anne. Oh, how she scolded! She said I was the worst behaved girl she ever saw, and that my parents ought to be ashamed of the way they'd brought me up. She says she won't stay, and I'm sure I don't care, but father and mother do." "Why didn't you tell them it was my fault?" demanded Anne. "It's likely I'd do such a thing, isn't it?" said Diana, with just scorn. "I'm no telltale, Anne Shirley, and anyhow, it was just as much to blame as you." "Well, I'm going to tell her myself," said Anne, resolutely. Diana stared. "Anne Shirley, you'd never why, she'll eat you alive." "Don't frighten me any more than I'm frightened," implored Anne. "I'd rather walk up to a cannon's mouth, but I've got to do it, Diana. It was my fault, and I've got to confess. I've had practice in confessing, fortunately." "Well, she's in the room," said Diana. "You can go in if you want to. I wouldn't dare, and I don't believe you'll do a bit of good." With this encouragement, Anne bearded the lion in its den; that is to say, she walked resolutely up to the sitting room door and knocked faintly. A sharp "Come in" followed. Miss Josephine Barry, thin, prim, and rigid, was knitting fiercely by the fire, her wrath quite unappeased, and her eyes snapping through her gold rimmed glasses. She wheeled around in her chair, expecting to see Diana, and beheld a white faced girl whose great eyes were brimmed up with a mixture of desperate courage and shrinking terror. "Who are you?" demanded Miss Josephine Barry, without ceremony. "I am Anne Shirley of Green Gables," said the small visitor tremulously, clasping her hands with her characteristic gesture, "and I've come to confess, if you please." "Confess what?" "That's all my fault about the jumping into bed on you last night. I suggested it. Diana would never have thought of such a thing, I'm sure. Diana's a very ladylike girl, Mrs. Barry, so you must see how unjust it is to blame her." "Oh, I must, eh? I rather think Diana did her share of the jumping at least. Such carryings on in a respectable house." "But we were only having fun," persisted Anne. "I think you ought to forgive us, Miss Barry, now that we've apologized; and anyhow, please forgive Diana, and let her have her music lessons. Diana's heart is set on her music lessons, Mrs. Barry, and I know too well what it is to have your heart set on a thing and not get it. If you must be cross with anyone, be cross with me. I've been so used to it in my early days to having people cross at me that I can endure it much better than Diana can." Much of the snap had gone out of the old lady's eyes by this time, and was replaced by a twinkle of amused interest, but she still said severely, "I don't think it is any excuse for you that you were only in fun. Little girls never indulged in that kind of fun when I was young. You don't know what it is to be awakened out of a sound sleep after a long and arduous journey by two great girls coming bounce down on you." "I don't know, but I can imagine," said Anne, eagerly. "I'm sure it must have been very disturbing; but then there was our side of it too. Have you any imagination, Miss Barry? If you have, just put yourself in our place. We didn't know there was anybody in that bed, and you nearly scared us to death. It was simply awful the way we felt, and then we couldn't sleep in the spare room after being promised. I suppose you are used to sleeping in spare rooms, but just imagine what you'd feel like if you were a little orphan girl who had never had such an honor." All the snap had gone by this time. Miss Barry actually laughed, a sound which caused Diana, waiting in speechless anxiety in the kitchen outside, to give a great gasp of relief. "I'm afraid my imagination is a little rusty; it's so long since I used it," she said. "I dare say your claim to sympathy is just as strong as mine. It all depends on the way we look at it. Sit down and tell me about yourself." "I am very sorry I can't," said Anne, firmly. "I'd like to, because you seem like an interesting lady, and you might even be a kindred spirit, although you don't look very much like it; but it's my duty to go home to Miss Marilla Cuthbert. Miss Marilla Cuthbert is a very kind lady, who is taking me to bring up properly. She is doing her best, but it is very discouraging work. You must not blame her because I jumped on the bed. But before I go, I do wish that you would tell me if you will forgive Diana, and stay as long as you meant to in Avonlea." "I think perhaps I will, if you will come over and talk to me occasionally," said Mrs. Barry. That evening Miss Barry gave Diana a silver bangle bracelet, and told the senior members of the household that she had unpacked her valise. "I've made up my mind to stay, simply for the sake of getting better acquainted with that Anne girl," she said frankly. "She amuses me, and at my time of life an amusing person is a rarity." Marilla's only comment when she heard the story was, "I told you so." This was for Matthew's benefit. Miss Barry stayed her month out and over. She was a more agreeable guest than usual, for Anne kept her in good humor. They became firm friends. When Miss Barry went away, she said, "Remember, you Anne girl, when you come to town you're to visit me, and I'll put you in my very spare room bed to sleep." Miss Barry was a kindred spirit after all, Anne confided to Marilla. "You wouldn't think so to look at her, but she is. You don't find it right out at first, as in Matthew's case, but after a while you come to see it. Kindred spirits are not so scarce as I used to think. It's splendid to find out there are so many of them in the world." End of chapter 19.